Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You live in a city where people vanish without a trace. No bodies. No funerals. No evidence. Just silence. For years, mothers searched for their sons, wives searched for their husbands, and families clung to hope that maybe, just maybe, the missing were alive somewhere. But the truth was far more disturbing than anyone could imagine. In the shadows of Tijuana, Mexico, a city choking under cartel wars, there was a man whose job wasn't to kill. His orders were far more chilling. When the cartels wanted someone to disappear permanently, they didn't bury the body. They didn't dump it in the ocean. They brought it to one man, a man who would make it vanish forever, leaving nothing behind but sludge and broken bones. His name was Santiago Meza Lopez. But the world would know him by a different name. El Pozolero. The stew maker. His tool wasn't a gun, a knife, or even explosives. It was a 55-gallon steel drum filled with industrial acid. Night after night, he dissolved flesh, bone, and identity, turning human lives into nothing but liquid waste. And in his own words, he admitted to doing it over 300 times. Think about that. More than 300 families robbed of closure. More than 300 people reduced to nothing but steam and sludge. The terrifying part? For years, no one even knew he existed. So who was this man? Was he a sadistic killer hiding behind the mask of cartel orders, or just a desperate pawn forced into a role that no human being should ever play? Tonight, we step into the story of El Pozolero. And what you are about to hear will stay with you long after this video ends. But before we dive into the nightmare he created, we have to go back to understand the chaos, the bloodshed, and the war that gave birth to him. Because to understand El Pozolero, we must first understand the city of Tijuana and the cartels that tore it apart. This is the story of a man who erased lives, not with bullets, not with knives, but with acid. The man who made hundreds of people vanish, leaving behind nothing but fear. This is the story of El Pozolero. In the heart of Tijuana's bloody cartel wars, his name became legend, whispered like a ghost in the streets. A man hidden in shadows, carrying a secret so horrific, it scarred Mexico forever. This is the untold story of the stew maker.
You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story.
To understand El Pozolero, we must first understand the world that gave birth to him. A world where fear ruled the streets, where money bought loyalty, and where death came without warning. Welcome to Tijuana in the early 2000s, a city on fire, a battlefield in Mexico's bloody war on drugs. Tijuana was more than just a border town. It was one of the most valuable drug corridors in the world. Just a few steps across the border lay San Diego, California, and beyond it, the United States, the largest consumer of narcotics on Earth. For decades, this city was controlled by the Arellano Felix organization, one of the most feared cartels in Mexico. Known for their brutality, they dominated Tijuana with executions, kidnappings, and an army of sicarios, cartel hitmen who ruled with bullets and terror. But power breeds enemies. By the mid-2000s, the Sinaloa cartel, led by the infamous Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, moved to take control of Tijuana. What followed was not just a turf war. It was a bloodbath. Day by day, the city descended into chaos. Police officers were assassinated in broad daylight. Judges and journalists were silenced. Ordinary families lived in constant fear, never knowing if their loved ones would make it home alive. And yet, for every murder, there was a bigger problem: bodies. Hundreds of them. Corpses piling up on the streets, in abandoned houses, dumped in shallow graves. Too many for the authorities to handle. Too many to hide. That's when the cartels turned to a solution so horrifying, It's almost impossible to believe. Instead of hiding their crimes, the cartels sought to erase them. To make human beings vanish as if they had never existed. And that's where Santiago Meza Lopez entered the story. A poor man from humble beginnings who would become the most notorious cartel cleaner in Mexico's history. But before he became El Pozolero, the stew maker, he was just Santiago. An ordinary man living in extraordinary darkness. And his descent into this nightmare began with a single decision, one that would change his life forever. Before the world called him El Pozolero, he was just Santiago Meza Lopez. Born in 1964 in poverty, in the small town of Nayarit, Mexico. He grew up in a country where opportunity was scarce, and survival often depended on hard labor and silence. His family was humble, struggling every day to put food on the table. Like many young boys in Mexico, Santiago left school early and learned to work with his hands. He became a bricklayer, a construction worker, anything that could pay just enough to survive. But poverty can be a trap. For Santiago, every peso earned was barely enough. The streets of Tijuana whispered promises of fast money, and in a city drowning in cartel wars, those promises came with a dangerous price. At first, Santiago wasn't a killer. He wasn't even a gangster. He was a man looking for work. And in Tijuana, the cartels were always hiring. They needed drivers, lookouts, bricklayers to build stash houses, and workers who wouldn't ask questions. For a time, Santiago blended in, just another worker in the machinery of organized crime. But the cartels saw something in him. He was quiet. He was obedient. And above all, he was desperate. Those traits made him valuable. Those traits made him dangerous. When he was first approached by the Arellano Felix cartel, Santiago believed he was simply working construction. Building walls. Mixing cement. But slowly, the walls closed in. And soon, the cartel would reveal the real job they had in mind for him. From a poor bricklayer trying to feed his family, Santiago Meza Lopez would be transformed into something else. Something the world had never seen before. And it would all begin with his first assignment, the first body he was ordered to erase. It began like any other night. Santiago thought he was being called to do more construction work, maybe repair a safe house, maybe patch a wall where bullets had torn through. But when he arrived, the job was different. And the smell hit him before he even walked through the door. Inside, a group of cartel enforcers stood silently around a tarp on the floor. When they pulled it back, Santiago froze. It was a body. Lifeless. Cold. He had seen death before, but never like this. One of the men handed him a mask, a pair of rubber gloves, and pointed to the corner of the room. There, waiting in the shadows, was a steel barrel. At first, Santiago thought it was a test. Maybe they wanted to see if he would panic, if he would refuse. But then, without a word, one of the enforcers poured a thick white powder into the barrel, caustic soda. Another brought buckets of water. The chemical hissed and smoked, filling the room with a suffocating stench. Then came the order. Put him in. Santiago's hands trembled as they lifted the body. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream. But the men standing behind him weren't making suggestions. They were giving him his first command as part of the cartel. The body hit the liquid with a sickening splash. Almost instantly, the skin began to bubble, peeling away, releasing a stench so foul it clawed into Santiago's throat. He gagged. He wanted to vomit. But the enforcers told him to keep stirring, keep working, until nothing was left. Hour after hour, Santiago stirred the barrel. The man before him, whoever he had been, was vanishing into sludge. By the time dawn broke, only fragments of bone and teeth remained. Santiago looked at his hands. They were shaking. But he had done it. He had followed orders. That night, Santiago Meza Lopez was no longer a bricklayer. He was no longer just another desperate worker. He had proven himself to the cartel. And from that moment forward, his new job was clear: erase the bodies. Erase the evidence. Erase entire lives. The first body was only the beginning. In the years that followed, the cartels would send him victim after victim, night after night. And each time, Santiago drowned a little more of his soul in acid. Soon, he would not only accept the job, he would perfect it. After that first night, there was no turning back. The cartel had found their man, and Santiago had found his fate. From then on, the orders came regularly. Rival dealers. Suspected traitors. Even innocents caught in the crossfire. They were all delivered to him the same way, wrapped, silent, lifeless. His workshop was a hidden house in Tijuana, a simple cinderblock building that became a factory of disappearance. Inside, lined against the walls, were the drums. Dozens of them. Steel containers filled with acid, hissing and bubbling like cauldrons of death. The process became routine. Caustic soda. Water. Fire. A body dropped in and stirred until nothing recognizable remained. Bones softened, skin melted, faces vanished. By dawn, the only evidence left was a toxic stew, poured into drains or pits in the ground. And Santiago didn't just do it once or twice. Over the years, he admitted to dissolving more than 300 bodies. 300 lives. 300 families robbed of closure, their loved ones erased without a grave, without a trace. But the horror wasn't just in the numbers. It was in the silence. Neighbors lived near the house, unaware of what was happening behind those walls. Sometimes they noticed a strange chemical smell. Sometimes the drains ran hot with foul liquid. But no one dared to ask questions. In Tijuana, questions could get you killed. The cartel paid him little for his work. By his own confession, just $200 a week. $200, to erase a human life. He later claimed he did it because he was desperate, because poverty left him no choice. But to the families of the vanished, excuses didn't matter. Their loved ones were gone. Santiago worked like this for years, becoming numb, almost mechanical. Body after body, barrel after barrel. He was no longer just a man. He was the cartel's ghost, the eraser of lives, the stew maker. And the city whispered of disappearances with no answers, never knowing that the truth was boiling in acid right beside them. But Tijuana was changing. The killings escalated. The cartel wars grew bloodier. And as Santiago's barrels filled night after night, the city itself was drowning in violence. The stew maker wasn't just a secret anymore. He was part of a much larger nightmare. As Santiago stirred his barrels of death, the streets outside were turning into war zones. Tijuana became one of the most violent cities on earth, as rival cartels fought to control the border. Every block, every street corner, every shipment route was painted in blood. The Arellano Felix organization, once untouchable, was under siege. The Sinaloa cartel, led by El Chapo Guzman, was pushing in. The result wasn't just a turf war. It was a massacre. Gunfights broke out in broad daylight, in shopping centers, in restaurants, even outside schools. Corruption ran deep. Police officers were bought, judges were threatened, politicians were assassinated. And for those who couldn't be bought, there was only one outcome: death. In Tijuana, the law no longer belonged to the government. It belonged to the cartels. The killings escalated so quickly that morgues overflowed. Bodies stacked up in hallways, refrigerated trucks lined with corpses. Journalists documented the carnage, but many of them would never live to publish their reports. And all the while, Santiago kept working. The cartels were killing faster than the city could bury their dead. For every body left in the streets, another was delivered to his acid drums, erased from existence. He wasn't just cleaning up after the war, he was part of its machinery. By 2008, Tijuana's murder rate exploded. Families lived in constant fear, curfews meant nothing, and entire neighborhoods emptied overnight. It was said that you could hear gunfire every evening, like a grim soundtrack to the city's collapse. And yet, for all the violence, the most terrifying thing was what you didn't see: the ones who disappeared. Because while gunfights left bodies in the open, Santiago's work left nothing at all. Families filed missing person reports, clinging to hope, never knowing their loved ones were dissolving in acid. The war raged on, the bodies kept coming, and the whispers about a man who could make people vanish grew louder. Authorities didn't have a name. They didn't have an address. But in the streets, in the bars, in hushed conversations, a new legend was born, El Pozolero, the stew maker. By 2007, rumors about a man who could make bodies disappear spread through Tijuana like wildfire. The whispers terrified even hardened criminals. But the police didn't believe it at first. Dissolving human bodies in acid? It sounded like a myth, until the disappearances became impossible to ignore. Families begged for answers. Mothers carried photos of their missing sons to police stations. Fathers demanded justice. But without bodies, without evidence, the investigations went nowhere. It was as if the victims had evaporated into thin air. But behind the silence, investigators noticed a strange pattern. Certain disappearances were tied to cartel hotspots. Certain neighborhoods whispered about trucks moving in the night. And there was always the same detail, barrels being delivered to warehouses at odd hours. One night, a police surveillance team followed one of those trucks. Their hearts raced as it pulled into a rundown warehouse. But just as they prepared to move in, gunfire erupted. A cartel convoy ambushed them. The officers barely escaped alive, while the truck and its barrels vanished. For Santiago, close calls like this became routine. He worked in the shadows, moving from one safe house to another, always protected by cartel gunmen. Authorities were chasing a ghost. A man they knew only by whispers, El Pozolero. Investigators grew more desperate. Anonymous tips trickled in. Informants claimed that the cartels had a stew maker. One whispered, he turns men into pozole. At first, police laughed at the absurdity. But soon, they realized this wasn't a joke. It was real. Raids were launched across Tijuana, warehouses stormed, doors kicked in. But every time, the man was gone. Sometimes only hours before. Sometimes leaving behind the faint smell of chemicals, and the ghostly stain of something that had been destroyed. It was a race against time. The police needed proof before the cartels silenced him forever. And so, the hunt for El Pozolero intensified. But the closer they got, the more dangerous the game became, for him, and for them. By 2009, the legend of El Pozolero haunted Tijuana. He was no longer just a rumor. Too many people had vanished. Too many families had no answers. For the government, capturing him wasn't just about solving crimes. It was about proving they had control over a city drowning in blood. Intelligence finally led investigators to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Tijuana. A small, unremarkable house. From the outside, it looked ordinary. Inside, it hid one of the most wanted men in Mexico. At 6 a.m. on January 23, 2009, federal agents surrounded the property. They moved silently, weapons drawn, hearts pounding. For years, he had slipped through their fingers. Now, they were ready to take him alive. When they stormed the house, there was no shootout, no gunfire, no resistance. Inside, they found Santiago Meza Lopez, sitting calmly, as if he had been waiting. The man who erased hundreds of lives was arrested without a single bullet fired. His capture sent shockwaves across Mexico. Headlines screamed his nickname, El Pozolero. The man who turned human beings into stew. Suddenly, the myth had a face. Ordinary. Almost forgettable. And that was what made him terrifying. When questioned, Santiago admitted everything. He calmly explained how he disposed of bodies in acid, describing his work like a man discussing construction labor. To him, it was just a job. To Mexico, it was a nightmare. He told investigators he had dissolved more than 300 people over 9 years. Some victims were cartel rivals. Others were kidnapped innocents. And he never asked who they were, he only asked when to begin. For families, his arrest was bittersweet. The truth had a name, but not closure. There were no bodies to bury, no graves to visit. Only the endless torment of knowing their loved ones had been erased in barrels of acid. El Pozolero was paraded before cameras, his story told around the world. To some, he was a monster. To others, he was just another victim of a system where human life had no value. But one thing was certain, his arrest marked the end of a terrifying chapter in Tijuana's history. But even in custody, the shadow of El Pozolero lingered. What he revealed about his work, and the evidence investigators uncovered in his safehouses, would horrify the nation. Because if the killing shocked Mexico, the aftermath would be even worse. After his arrest, the investigation widened. Federal police combed through El Pozolero's properties, searching for evidence of the unimaginable. What they found confirmed Mexico's worst fears. On the outskirts of the city, investigators uncovered steel barrels buried underground, contaminated soil soaked in chemicals, and fragments that once belonged to human beings. The evidence was overwhelming. Forensic experts sifted through the soil. Tiny bone fragments, teeth, and scraps of clothing were recovered. They were all that remained of countless victims. Families desperate for closure clung to the hope that DNA tests might identify their missing loved ones. But the truth was far darker. Most of the remains had been dissolved beyond recognition. For many families, there would never be answers. No bodies. No burials. Only silence. El Pozolero confessed with unnerving calm. He explained how he mixed caustic soda in drums, how he stirred the solution, how it took hours for flesh and bone to melt away. He gave details as if he were describing routine labor, not mass murder. To him, it was just a job. He claimed he was paid $600 a week to make people disappear. In his words, he never killed anyone, he only cleaned up the mess. But to the world, that distinction meant nothing. Mexico was horrified. International media branded him the stew maker. His story became a symbol of the country's darkest reality, that in the war on drugs, human life had been reduced to nothing more than waste to be disposed of. To this day, El Pozolero sits in prison. But the ghosts of his work still haunt Mexico. For every family still searching, for every name still missing, his legacy is a wound that refuses to heal. The story of El Pozolero is more than a tale of one man's crimes. It is a mirror of a system where corruption, violence, and greed allowed a monster to operate in plain sight for nearly a decade. 300 souls dissolved. 300 families left searching for answers that may never come. The legacy of El Pozolero is not just the horror of what he did, but the silence he left behind. And as you watch this story, ask yourself, how many more secrets remain buried? How many more names will never be spoken, erased by acid, erased by fear? If stories like this need to be told, then don't let them vanish into silence. Subscribe to this channel, share this story, and keep these voices alive. Because if we forget, the shadows win. Your click, your share, your voice, it matters. Because every story we tell here brings light into the darkness, and forces the world to face what it tried to bury. This was the story of Santiago Meza Lopez. El Pozolero. The man who turned the unthinkable into routine. The man who boiled away the lives of hundreds, leaving only whispers in the dark. Until next time, remember, the shadows are always closer than you think.